I am Lindsay Baranowski. I'm treasurer for the Non-Academic Staff Association on campus, and it's my pleasure to moderate our session today entitled Public Services and Democracy. We have two speakers who are going to have about half an hour each, and then we'll do about 15 minutes for Q&A. I'll just ask that you make sure you have the mic before you begin asking your question. So our first speaker is Trevor Harrison. Trevor is director... You can't hear? Sorry, I'll speak a little bit louder. Trevor is director of the Parkland Institute. He's a professor of sociology in the Faculty of Arts and Science at the University of Lethbridge, and associate director and research affiliate of the Prentice Institute for Global Population and Economy. He will be followed by Dru Oja Jay. He is a writer, organizer, and web developer based in Montreal. He's a co-founder of the media co-op Journal Ensemble, Friends of Public Services, and Courage. He is co-author, along with Nicholas Barry Shaw, of Paved with Good Intentions, Canada's Development NGOs from Idealism to Imperialism. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Trevor.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. Wow, thank you, and you haven't even heard me yet, so okay. Great to see so many friends and colleagues that from past years, and also some new faces here today as well. What I'm going to do is, I was just saying to Dru, I'm going to kind of be, using a hockey analogy, I'm going to get the assist and then hand off the puck to Dru, who's going to score the goal here. I'm going to broadly try to describe what's going on with public services in a number of different countries. And I picked these actually strategically in the data that I'm going to show you here because of the different kinds of social and political and economic formations that these are. So the 8 countries, and I consistently are going to try to do this through the statistics, are looking at the Scandinavian countries, and those of you, of course, took in Linda McQuaig's talk the other evening. She emphasized the importance of the Scandinavian model. So what I've done is selected Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. 2 other countries that are sometimes referred to as conservative democracies in some sense, France and Germany. And 3 other countries that are often referred to as the Anglo-democracies, Canada, the United States, and the UK. And within that, if you're familiar with the work of Esping Anderson, the United States, in his work and subsequent work that's been done, has always been held up as kind of an extreme model of liberal democratic practices. And so what I'm going to do is take you through some data showing differences in terms of public sector employment, but also the economies they have, and then finally link, in some ways, the importance of the public sector and public sector workers and service to the notion of democracy. So I'm going to take you through each of those things. Let me see. So how do I get to the next thing? Oop, that is not going to work. So we can go with this. Okay, this is fine. So what you see here is public sector spending in OECD countries. You're all familiar with what OECD stands for, the Organization for Economic Compulsive Disorder. Anyway, so what you see here, and you can kind of parse out some of the countries that I've mentioned before, and you'll see that, by and large, in terms of those 8 countries that I talked about earlier, you see Canada and the United States fairly low down on this, the United Kingdom sort of in the middle, and then you look at the top and you see again Germany, Sweden, France at the top in terms of social spending. And that's social spending broadly kind of conceptualized here. Public sector employment. So it was interesting when I, again, looked at these particular figures. I was actually thrown off at first by, I was pretty sure that Germany had pretty high public sector employment. But in fact, on the particular graph or chart I find, it said, well, Germany only had 10.6% of total employment. And I thought, well, that seems kind of weird. I'm pretty sure Germany actually spends a fair amount. They have pretty good civil service there. So I had to go looking for an explanation. And what I found was that roughly about 2/3 of the German workforce, publicly paid for, is defined as civil service, and only 10.6% is public service. But you add them together and it's actually over 30%. And the reason here is because it's actually divided between the way they're actually the kind of protections they get as employees and the benefits and everything else they get. Effectively, there's no real difference, but they're actually divided there. So you add them together and you see that it's actually over 30% as well. So in the 8 countries, again, that I want to emphasize here, Germany over 30%, followed by the 3 Scandinavian countries, Norway, Denmark, Sweden, France at 21.4%, and then you look at the other countries here. And again, the Anglo-democracies come down really low in terms of public service. And this is something that's actually been decreasing over time. The pressures on public service, we know what kind of the neoconservative arguments have been. You know, the workers are overpaid, they get protections that the private sector doesn't get. You know, this is unfair in some sense. It's a drain on economic development. And so we've seen pressures on the public service in these countries over the last number of decades, keeping in mind here that the United States never actually did have really high employment there. It was certainly higher during the 1950s, but it also has been very much under pressure over the last 20, 30 years, going back to the Reagan Revolution. So, point 1 here. If you just quickly kind of scan the results of these 8 countries and the data that I've just shown you, the point is Scandinavian and other Northern European countries tend to have higher levels of public service employment than do the Anglo-democracies, including Canada. Income inequality. This probably is not going to come to a great surprise to you, but these are based on Gini coefficients. Just a reminder here that the way Gini coefficients work is that the higher the number, then what you have is higher amounts of inequality. The lower the number means that you're actually getting closer to some kind of notion of basic equality. In only some kind of imaginary utopia do you probably get down to zeros. And of course, at the other end, if you actually saw a Gini coefficient that was at 1, what you mean, the way you define that is one person has all of the money and no one else has anything, right? And in fact, if you actually did kind of a Gini coefficient for the whole world, we know from Oxfam figures over the last few years, what we see is, I just read the other day, something like 5 people now have half the world's wealth, right? I mean, it's become outrageous. In just the last few years, that's gone from 82 people to 65 people, and again, as I read the other day, 5 people, right? So we're getting pretty close to that 1, but we probably won't ever quite achieve it. Again, though, United States, very, very high Gini coefficient. It's been ranging in and around 40 for the last number of years. There's a real economic problem here, of course, over and above any kind of issues of morality or ethics or anything else. Economically, when all the money is concentrated in a few hands, they don't want to spend anymore, so the economy actually comes to a grinding halt. One of the big problems going on in the world right now is, in terms of the Western economies, is there's a lot of money sitting on the sidelines looking for some great investment vehicle where they can make a ton of money, and so they don't want to spend, right? Because there's too much money in a few hands. The other political problem is when money concentrates in the hands of a few people, and even if you like to say Bill Gates is a wonderful person, the fact is Bill Gates and other billionaires get to decide what is going to be spent on and what is not going to be spent on, right? And that's fundamentally undemocratic. Again, though, to the 8 countries that I've parsed out here from the, what we think of as kind of Western developed countries, the United States, United Kingdom, and Canada, right at the top of these high Gini coefficients, and these have been rising over the last 30 years. France and Germany, those kind of conservative democratic models, corporatist for sure, particularly in the case of Germany, in the middle, and then the Scandinavian countries again, in terms of equality, closer to some kind of regime of equality than you find otherwise.
Are they the lowest in the world, the Scandinavian countries?
They'd be the lowest in the world, yeah. Well, I mean, the only way you could find something lower would be a country that was so fundamentally undeveloped that everybody is at the same level, at a very low level of development, right? So,
Germany, did you say they're corporatists?
yeah, Germany is actually kind of often described as a kind of corporatist democracy in the sense they actually have a really interesting tripartite system of deciding how they're going to develop their economy. So unions have a very big role in Germany. So when they sit down together, it's the employers, the businesses, the unions, and the government. And this kind of tripartite agreement about what will be produced, how it will be produced, and the wage levels and everything else. So it's a very, very, whereas here unions tend to be left out of that. Okay. So one of the things that happens when you have, when you talk about the economy and inequality, one of the things we actually see is that people demand better public services as income rises. So, it makes sense. As you start to increase your own income, perhaps you say, okay, well, I'd really like better health care here, and I'm willing to pay for it through the tax system. I want dental care, I want all kinds of other things, right? But as income equality actually starts to rise too high, one of the things is the very, very rich begin to say, well, I can buy even better services privately, right? And by the way, and we've heard this argument repeatedly, if you will just let me buy things, what would otherwise be termed public services privately, I'm doing you a favor here because I'm no longer going to be taking from public services, right? So I'm not going to be taking away services. I'm actually moving and outside of that to use services that are for sale in the private marketplace. And that frees up space, say, in hospitals or whatever for other people to be able to use. The problem here is that as the very, very wealthy begin to form their own clubs to purchase what would be normally thought of as public services, they also start to then put pressure on to have their own tax rates reduced. Because their argument is, of course, we're not using the public services, therefore, why should we have to pay for it? I was actually, interesting enough, in terms of this argument, I was just hearing this being debated on, I think it was on Fox News just yesterday. Yeah, no surprise. And the person who was doing the moderating was saying, but why should people of who don't have kids be paying for school taxes, all right? And thankfully, actually, even on Fox News, it was kind of interesting. There was a couple of people who were actually on this panel, and they responded, well, just a second here. We all kind of benefit from making sure that kids are actually educated. Like, it's not kind of this, you're losing out just because you're not paying your, you have to pay taxes here even though you don't have kids. But there is that argument out there, and it's been made repeatedly over the years. We hear it in terms of healthcare in this province, right? Why should, if people will just buy their services privately, they're doing you a favor. But of course, they again insist they should not have to pay taxes. So in some sense, it's a zero-sum game. As public services start to decline, the private area starts to increase. And one of the things we saw, of course, yesterday in terms of the wonderful session on healthcare issues, was that in fact, if you do start to depress and don't put enough money into the public services, this actually opens the floodgates for then the expansion of private healthcare. But you can count this among other kinds of public services as well. So, point 2. Scandinavian and other Northern European countries have lower levels of inequality than do the Anglo-democracies, including Canada. This inequality correlates with lower levels of public service employment. You've seen matching the first set of data with this. Okay, so let's tie it now together with some data in terms of democracy and the way it functions. What you see here is from fairly recent elections here, electoral participation, and you'll notice here that the United States, this is from 2012. This actually, the amount of participation here, by the way, this is kind of the Obama blip. One of the effects of the Obama elections was it actually got more people out, particularly young people who became excited. The United States electoral participation over the last number of decades has been dropping like a stone. I think one of the years, I think the first year that, the first or second time that George Bush was elected, it actually dropped under 50%, all right? At lower levels of elections in the United States, it's not surprising that you might get 28, 30, 32% of people actually turning out to vote. So the United States has historically very, very low levels. You have to go back some decades to find fairly high. The Canadian rate here for 2015, this also was a bump up from what it had been previously. This was actually kind of a high watermark compared with some of the more recent elections before that. On the other hand, if you look at places like Denmark at 80.3% of the voting age population, Norway at 78, Sweden at 82.6, France even, again, that mid-range kind of conservative democracy falls to 67.9. But what you see here is a very similar kind of pattern where the Scandinavian countries tend to have larger percentage of electoral participation and very low levels for the Anglo-democracies, the ones that have most bought into kind of the neoliberal project. Another really interesting part of this is who actually does participate. And we've heard throughout the discussions, the importance of taking into consideration things like race, ethnicity, gender, age. One of the, this is actually, I think this was from Pew data, or probably from the electoral data in the United States, looking at gender and age. And what you see here is that the first measure here is women as a percentage, over and above or below men. So you see in Denmark, actually more women than men, in fact, participate. Same for Norway, same for Sweden. And part of this is, a lot of the rules, regulations, things around unionization, employment standings that women in the Scandinavian countries tend to have a much more equal status in society, in the workplace, rules and regulations around family issues as well. And you'll see here in the United States, it actually bumped up again. This was a fairly recent election. This is again kind of the Obama bump. But otherwise, women again in the United States tend to be, in general, lower in terms of participation. Same thing for that election in terms of youth vote. You'll see there was again a bump. The excitement that Obama was able to generate resulted in higher levels of youth participation. But in general, that's not been the case. You'll notice here the United Kingdom particularly low on youth, many of whom are extremely alienated within that society from the electoral process. On the other hand, notice again, Sweden quite high, Norway quite high again, and Germany. And again, Denmark and Canada, again, I suspect there might have been a Trudeau effect in the case of Canada once again. Even more interesting, besides whether or not people actually turn out to vote, one of the questions is, did they actually show any great interest in politics? One thing I should say here, one Anglo-democracy I actually took out of the, and I had them in originally, I took it out, is Australia. And the reason I did, I wanted to have being able to compare the same countries throughout. Australia actually has a rule where you must vote. Okay, so that actually kind of skews the thing, because if you're actually forced to vote, there's a small penalty, but there is a penalty, and some people have debated whether or not you should actually have that. Part of the problem is democracy itself is not just about voting. All right? We know that democracy, if it means anything at all, is a much bigger thing than that. It's kind of being publicly engaged, at things such as coming out to Parkland conferences. This is kind of a democratic act of participating in your community. So just getting people to vote is perhaps not the best measure, although it's one measure. So, disinterest. I threw in here just a few other countries where, in terms of the not interested really at all. They didn't actually have on this particular site that I went to, they didn't have a figure for Canada, so it doesn't appear here. But once again, you'll see a really interesting thing. Germany, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, right at the lowest level of not interested in politics. US, 16. France, it's got a curious low thing here. I obviously hit the wrong button there. It's not supposed to be an exclamation. It's supposed to be 19. The UK at 24%. So again, if you think of it in terms of kind of general trend lines, what you see is Scandinavian countries seem to be stronger in terms of interest in politics and actual participation. And the Anglo-democracies, again, not so much.
What's wrong with Portugal and Chile and places like that, because they're not interested?
These are, by and large, fairly traditional authoritarian countries. In many instances, people may just have simply given up on the idea that politics doesn't matter because nothing's ever going to change. That's my very quick kind of summation. So point 3 here, before I get to kind of a big summary of what we've seen. Scandinavian countries, especially, and Germany and France, have higher levels of political participation than do the Anglo-democracies, including Canada. Anglo-democracies have lower levels of interest in politics than do the Scandinavian countries and Germany. And the US level has been repeatedly low, except for the Obama years, which saw a spike in female and young voters. So, and again, the key thing here is that, by and large, the Anglo-democracies, including Canada, have been the ones who've most bought into the kind of neoliberal project of downsizing and throwing things really onto the individual as opposed to viewing things in a kind of collective fashion. So, how do we understand everything that I've just taken you through here? Well, high inequality correlates with low public service, employment, and services, and with low voter participation, especially among women and youth, and in interest in politics. Why is that? Democracy and high levels of inequality cannot coexist. And this is actually pretty much a truism in fields of political science and philosophy going back hundreds of years. Plato wrote about this. Plato basically said that high levels of inequality was not commensurate with democracy. You can't have a democratic society where huge levels of inequality translate into, as I've said here, instead of one person, one vote, it's $1, one vote. And when a few people have millions, billions, and perhaps eventually trillions of dollars versus everybody else, this is not a recipe for democracy. And again, not just Plato, but Tocqueville. Interesting enough, and we've heard Harsha Wale was talking yesterday about the importance of race and ethnicity. Thinking about those issues in terms of some of the problems that we actually face in Canada and elsewhere. Tocqueville, when he was writing his famous tome about the United States, he warned, he said, this is a democracy, a really interesting experiment, but there's a couple of things actually that I see as perhaps going wrong here. One, he says, race. Race is a fundamental aspect of, and he's writing in the 1830s, he says this is a real problem for the United States in terms of democracy. And the other thing he says, the growing power of the industrialists, the growing threat of inequality in the United States is going to make the democratic project impossible. In the 1960s, in the United States, pluralist theorists used to talk about, well, no, the inequality is not a big deal, and there's mechanisms here by which the wealthy never really quite get just what they demand because there's checks and balances in the system. The whole American ideal was based on checks and balances. Even pluralist theorists, such as Robert Dahl, have started to question that in the last few years. Study from Princeton a couple of years back said the United States is no longer a democracy. It's what it is an oligarchy based on looking at where power resides and where the differences in money are. So if equality is a basis for democracy, how does this fit into the notion of public services? Public services, in the way that Esping Anderson wrote about it years ago and others have continued to do so, argue that public services decommodify things that are important to all of us: healthcare, education, social services, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If you don't decommodify things, they are left then to be purchased in the marketplace. And the marketplace by its nature is unequal. Well-funded public services ensure a basic level of equality for everybody. Irrespective of the differences that appear in the marketplace, public services are essential to the equality that makes democracy possible. The reason that people feel that they want to go engage publicly, to vote, to do all the things that are important to a democracy is because they believe they are part of their society through the kinds of services that make them an equal with every other citizen. That is the connection between public services and democracy fundamentally. Thank you.
Thank you, Trevor. I'll turn it over to Dru, but I'll just remind you to please hold questions until the end, and then we can deal with them all.
So just before I start, I just wanted to ask everyone to stand up, if you don't mind. And I just want you to think about how public services can address the main crises that we're facing. So environmental, social, economic, democratic. Just think of a few ideas about any public services. Could be health services, could be public transportation, etc. How those things can address those crises. And I just turn to somebody, ideally you don't know, and we're just going to brainstorm a few ideas for like 2 minutes. Go. What's that? For the sake of the video. Yeah, no problem. I'll use the mic. Yeah. So I was just trying to take advantage of the time that we. Yeah.
I hope that set you up well.
No, that was great. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, cheers. Yeah, it was like right down to the it was like a 30-second margin. It was pretty impressive. All right, 30 more seconds. All right, folks, let's wrap it up. If you can hear me, clap 2 times. If you can hear me, clap 3 times. All right, your attention, please. It's almost like talking to each other is more fun than listening to people talk at you. So just real quick, I just want to get a few ideas. Did anybody talk about how public services could help to address the environmental crisis? Yeah.
Reduce the sort of clamor and demand for jobs on pipelines and build things like public long-term care and public transit instead.
Reduce pipelines, create long-term care and not pipelines, public transit instead. Sorry, I'm still getting warmed up here. Anyone else? Environment? Yes.
So, my background is in park planning, so parks, leisure lands, and parks provide carbon sequestration, reduce heat islands.
Amazing. Thank you. Anyone else? Yeah, in the back.
I was speaking to, so I don't deserve credit for this, but raised the issue of agricultural land reserves to protect agricultural land. And I think that falls generally under the environmental issue.
That's great. Thank you. A crisis of inequality. We do face a crisis of inequality. Trevor was talking about it quite a bit. Does anyone have thoughts on how public services could address that? Yeah. Excellent. So lower cost / free education. Joel, yeah.
Talking about universal dental care and how it doesn't make sense that that won't hurt our bodies as part of the healthcare system, and it especially impacts people that can't afford to pay for it.
Absolutely. Universal dental care. Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you.
Union density tends to be higher in public services.
Yeah. Or does public service tend to be higher in union density? Or so one more, crisis of democracy, just in a couple words. Anyone? Yeah.
Maybe again, at this point, I think the education is the key. So you need education.
Education again. Yeah, that's great. Anyone else? More teachers in the classrooms. That does help democracy. Anyone else? Great.
Share the economy under democratic control of some kind.
Excellent. Yeah, democratic control of the economy, it definitely increases democracy. Yeah.
Trying to involve people more in democracy, in voting.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you. So basically, I think you all collectively have the knowledge already of everything that's in my presentation, so you can all go home now if you want. But I'm going to go into the depth, a little more depth on a specific campaign that I worked on called Delivering Community Power. So that's so hopefully this will be sort of useful for you in terms of just getting another layer of depth and maybe a few ideas coming into that you can bring to the work that you do. So back in 2015, when we were still in the dark days of the Harper administration, I was part of a group called Friends of Public Services, and we had a very simple goal. Basically, we wanted to connect people who had voted Conservative in 2011 to the fact that their door-to-door was being cut by the Conservatives. A lot of people didn't know, they were definitely unhappy about having their door-to-door mail delivery cut, but they had no idea it was coming from the Conservative government. So we made this handy flyer, and in cooperation with postal workers, we distributed about 120,000 of them across the country, mostly focused on key ridings, and we ran sort of online ads, again, in those key ridings that were seen by about 500,000 people. So when, just going back to Martin's question yesterday, when the Liberals actually won in the landslide that they did, it felt a little bit like pushing the rock up the hill or the boulder up the hill and then just having it roll all the way back down again, because we had to start all over. It's like we had spent all this time demonizing Harper, and now the Liberals are in, they're bright, they're shiny, they're new. Everybody thinks everybody's going to wait and see, give them a chance, etc. And we knew that they're going to come up with the same privatization agenda, that they had pursued vigorously, even more vigorously than the Conservatives in the 90s. And they did. But we knew that we would have to sort of start all over. So it was sort of an initial just sort of sense of exhaustion and disorientation, because now we have people that are in government who are saying that they're green and democratic and all these things, even if we had a strong idea that they would turn out not to be. So it was in January of 2016, sort of in the aftermath of that, so we started to sort of regain our footing and started to think about, okay, how do we respond to the situation creatively? And that sort of led to the question of, okay, what is Canada Post? Like, let's get existential here. So we came up with a few answers. And I mean, sort of this is on the backdrop of the fact that Canada Post is typically sort of portrayed as on the decline, sort of an aging institution that's no longer relevant in our electronic age. And it's true that letter mail is declining, and also true that online ordering and packages are skyrocketing. So there's definitely some complexity. We don't want to avoid it, but we just wanted to go back to basics. So what is Canada Post? One thing Canada Post is a comprehensive and by far the largest logistics system in Canada. Canada Post can move objects from any point in the country to any other point in the country, door to door, and that's a huge capability to have just out of the gates. It's also the biggest retail network. So as some people, just think about the ubiquity of Tim Hortons. They're everywhere, but there are way more post offices, almost double the number of post offices that there are Tim Hortons. So that's a huge amount of retail space that mostly gets used to sell, Wayne Gretzky memorabilia and stamps. But if you've ever walked into a post office, there's a huge amount of empty space that could be used for all kinds of things, but it's not. And just to give it away, the reason for that is neoliberalism. So Canada Post is also the biggest marketing network that we have in the country. Nobody else, no other marketing agency, no TV station, no newspaper, nothing else can say, we can reach every single Canadian household with your message. And that's not just through flyers and addressed ad mail and so on. It's also through person-to-person contact. And so basically, we started to wonder, what if we took this huge capacity that we have that's publicly owned, and instead of allowing the neoliberal mindset to continue and to base, which, in the neoliberal mindset under liberals and conservatives had been, let's chop this up, sell it off to the highest bidder, and let the private sector manage this. But we have this tremendously powerful thing, and given that we are facing environmental, economic, and democratic crises, how could we use this incredible capacity that we have to further those things, as opposed to just giving it away to the private sector, which, as we know, doesn't have an amazing record. So to cut a long story short, I'm just curious, how many people are familiar with the Delivering Community Power campaign? All right, a few. The Delivering Community Power campaign. Yeah, so the Delivering Community Power campaign is basically what we did was we took a whole bunch of policies that postal workers had already been fighting for, sort of piecemeal, around moving toward a zero carbon fleet of transportation, basically to be able to move things from across the country without burning fossil fuels, or getting closer to that. Postal banking, and a bunch of other things, and basically put them into one comprehensive vision, saying, here's what our postal service could look like. So we made this handy booklet called Delivering Community Power, and we've been sort of distributing across the country via postal workers, and also holding discussions across the country. So a few sort of main aspects of this vision. Zero carbon logistics, electric charging stations at all of these 6,000 plus post offices that we have across the country, which would make it possible to drive across Canada with an electric car, and know that you can charge your car in at least one place in every town. Postal banking, so providing services to remote communities, but also creating a bank that can actually provide loans to do energy efficient retrofits, and so on. And also community-owned green energy, food delivery for remote communities. So one of the things that Harper cut was the food mail program, which is basically allows people in remote communities to order food very cheaply through Canada Post, and now people are paying like $30 for orange juice, and just absurdly high prices under the sort of the subsidies provided to the Northern Store by Stephen Harper. Again, there's all kinds of ways that Canada Post could support food sovereignty at all kinds of different local levels. There's community hubs. There's rural internet access. Canada Post actually has a mandate to help Canadians communicate, basically. So in rural areas where internet access is terrible, Canada Post would be sort of a natural provider, as opposed to trying to farm it out to the for-profit sector, where you get sort of low service for high cost, especially in places like in the far north, where people pay like often hundreds of dollars a month for internet access. So I'm just going to sum this all up with a quick video that in about 2 minutes tells you about the campaign. Nope. Sorry. Wrong video. Let's try that. Nope, not happening. Come on, video.
Some think of Canada Post as just letters and stamps. But here's the thing. In the next economy, our postal service could deliver everything from food to clean energy and create thousands of green jobs in the process. Canada Post is this country's largest transportation and shipping network, and we own it. There are almost twice as many post offices as Tim Hortons. That's a lot of post offices. So, how can we use this powerful network to drive the transition to a zero-carbon Canada? We could put solar panels on post offices, with retrofits to save energy. We could add charging stations to power our postal fleet and your electric car. Post offices could also provide banking services, without the big banks' unfair fees, and finance green infrastructure and businesses. We could build a fleet of electric postal vehicles built by unionized workers here in Canada. The Postal Service could deliver affordable food to remote communities in the north and support digital innovation across the country. With expanded door-to-door service, postal workers could coordinate with other care services and check in on people who sign up, helping us to live in our homes for longer as we age. We are ready to leap to a green economy based on caring for the earth and each other. A revitalized postal service can deliver it. From coast to coast to coast, support for this vision is growing fast. Visit deliveringcommunitypower.ca to join us, add your ideas, and get involved. And share this.
So I kind of, the process of sort of figuring out, what Canada Post is and what the potential is, I feel like it's akin to sort of taking off the neoliberalism colored glasses. We have to sort of, we really have to see things in a different way. When the corporate press and the mainstream economists see Canada Post, they see something that's in decline, that has, mainly has value in terms of being sold off to the private sector and generating income for investors. But if you look at it from a public services perspective, all of a sudden you have this tremendously powerful network that's way more powerful, all kept together and kept under public control. So I think of it as, I also think of it in terms of the metaphor of peeling the neoliberal onion. So you take off a layer. So for example, postal workers, there's all these sort of myths that Canada Post costs taxpayers money, but postal workers usually sort of respond by saying, no, we generate lots of profits, for Canadians, and that's all well and good, but it's actually way more progressive to cut stamp costs and fund it through corporate taxes. But all of us get stuck in this neoliberal mindset, so we have to sort of peel away the onion. So I like to say that when you peel the neoliberal onion, there are a lot of tears at the beginning, but by the end there's nothing left. Sorry, that's just a subliminal message. Don't pay attention to that. So I just want to talk about the sort of idea of having a bigger vision and long-term goals to look at. And I think one of the best examples of this is the student movement in Quebec. And I think public services in general tend to get stuck in this sort of defensive battle. There's a privatization that's about to happen. We have to fight against it and say, no, we want, but what we end up doing sort of implicitly is saying, we want the status quo. We want, which isn't the most inspiring message. So I think it's interesting to sort of learn from the student movement in Quebec, where there was very much a defensive battle. Basically, they wanted to cut. The government was trying to hike fees and to cut bursaries that students could get, basically making education more expensive. And they weren't. The student movement's immediate demands were not to. Their immediate demands were not to do anything really bold. It was just to maintain the status quo, to not raise fees, to not cut bursaries. But at the same time as they were fighting what amounted to a defensive battle, they were in the streets with this message, which is gratuité scolaire, means free education. So a transformative demand that is always on the banner behind the sort of immediate demand, which is, let's stop the immediate cuts. So with delivering community power, we've run a campaign that has really leveraged the power of postal workers across the country. Through sort of union locals, we've delivered over 60,000 pamphlets. 12,000 people have taken action online. 6,000 people submitted, and this is just through our site, submitted to the Canada Post review that the Liberals were doing. We did a 20-city tour. We've activated, I think, a lot of different people within just postal workers and also at the local community level in different places across the country who were not active before. We got a bunch of resolutions passed by CUPW locals basically to mandate that a bunch of these demands, so not just demands for better wages or demands for, better working conditions, but actually demands to transform Canada Post into an engine for the green economy have been passed. And so now what's really exciting is that they just started a new round of bargaining, which wraps up next summer. And in that bargaining, basically, they're not just demanding the sort of usual union demands, they're actually demanding a transformation of Canada Post. And as you know, 2018 is getting into the year before the election. So the potential of a postie strike, along with these sort of demands that are based on these much broader alliances with 50+ environmental and community groups, all of a sudden start to look like the Liberals might be in a bit of a fix. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. I just want to talk a little bit about the other sort of lessons that we can learn from this campaign so far. It's obviously we haven't won anything yet, but the campaign's just sort of getting ramped up. I think it's a long build to have demands this transformative. But I just want to talk a little bit about how this might apply to other public services. But before that, I just want to do a quick sort of caveat or warning. I mean, this is the prison guards on strike here in Alberta, and the message here, walking on the picket line for staff and offender safety, sort of sounds good on the face of it, but I think there's a real warning here, which is not all public services are unambiguously beneficial. I think we have to think about whether it's people who public servants who work for Indian in Northern or Indigenous in Northern Affairs Canada, or whether it's public servants who work for Child and Family Services. There's a lot of colonialism being carried out by public servants, and certainly adding to the prison industrial complex is another major item. And so I think a part of the solution to this, I mean, I think there are real contradictions that just have to be sort of figured out, case by case. But I think a real part of this is vision, is having a bigger common overarching vision for where we want to go as a society for our public services, and how that can actually, and how that creates a role for everyone. And that can really clarify, I think, some of these, especially if it's based on a social justice vision. So the first, I think, basic point is that workers have insight and capacity for innovation. I mean, this might be obvious to some people, and it's totally not obvious to others. But one of the really gratifying things when I was going across Canada talking about this project, one of the really gratifying things was, we sort of tried out all these ideas about what Canada Post could be, and there'd be some skepticism, there'd be some enthusiastic support, but among a lot of the postal workers who attended, there'd be a lot of, oh, I knew that, like that's sort of obvious to me in my job, and they would build on the ideas and extend them and talk about all these other ways, and all of a sudden you're realizing how much information there is in just the workers, because they're spending a huge amount of their lives interacting with these services. And I think most of that knowledge is untapped because of the sort of top-down and really anti-democratic nature of the way public services are run. So the fight for delivering community power is also a fight for democratizing Canada Post. I don't think we can talk about any of the things we're talking about: transforming Canada Post, investing in a zero carbon logistics system, turning post offices into community hubs. Like, none of that is compatible with the current top-down way that Canada Post is run, with nominally democratic appointees appointed by the government, and usually it just means they're patronage positions or ideological hires. Stephen Harper certainly put the sort of former senior vice president of Pitney Bowes, which is one of the main candidates to acquire Canada Post, at the head of Canada Post. So so this is the kind of thing that happens, and the Liberals obviously don't do things much differently. So really what we're talking about is creating worker and community control in a significant way over how Canada Post functions. So the other thing is that points of contact with the public are the starting points for alliance building. We started out talking about door-to-door delivery because that was a public service that people experience often on a daily basis. You know, they see postal workers, they interact with them, they have conversations with them, and so it was a really vital and a potent, I think, way that relationship as a starting point for people to start to think about Canada Post as politically. So bigger vision equals more potential alliances. I think this is also obvious, but the more if you can talk about Canada Post providing rural internet, all of a sudden there's a huge number of municipalities and small businesses and all kinds of other stuff, all kinds of other groups and people who are going to be interested in working with us. As soon as we start to talk about strengthening food sovereignty, all of a sudden there's a whole bunch of other groups that become potential allies. And I think this can apply to other public services as well. And that we tend to sort of try to group the sort of people who are immediately supportive, but I think the more we can become visionary and expansive in our idea of public services, and the more we can sort of transcend the sort of silos of individual public services, the more public support we're going to be able to marshal. And I think I touched on this before, but I think it bears repeating. We're not going to get more than we ask for. If we ask for the status quo, we might not even get that. But if we ask for everything, then we might get something. So I just want to wrap up with a few basic points. Public services are good for the environment. I mean, I think there's clearly some exceptions to this. If you consider the National Energy Board a public service, maybe not so good for the environment. But certainly public transportation, collectivizing things, and I think more broadly, just the fact that public services are owned by the public and not driven by profit means that you can mandate them to actually spend money, ideally from corporate tax dollars, to be not just up to spec, but on the leading edge of generating green energy, of conserving energy, of supporting the local, integrating with local businesses and cooperatives that are operating and setting new standards as opposed to sort of falling behind. I think Trevor covered this quite a bit, but public services are great for income and gender equality. I mean, I think the basic formula is if you create jobs that are helpful to the public, that generate the commons, and you do that by taxing the richest people and the corporations, it's going to redistribute income, and it's probably one of the most effective ways we have of redistributing wealth. And obviously, gender equity in terms of salaries isn't up to par in public services, but it's far ahead of the private sector. And that obviously has to do with higher union density, as someone pointed out earlier. I think there's one of the big obstacles, I think, to expanding public services is that there's a lot of resentment. And I think it's important to understand how some of the right-wing critiques of public services are well-founded and how they are not. So I think this sort of graph explains quite a bit. If people feel like they're paying more tax for less public services, it's because they are. And that's not because public services are becoming more inefficient or more expensive. It's because corporations are just paying less. And that's obviously reflected in inequality. So some of the most cherished public services are the result of social movements, or have not been privatized because of social movements. One way or the other, it's democratic power as opposed to the power of profit or capital, and often opposed to those things, that that has created the public services that we have. Social movements, electoral movements have fought for and won public services. But the compromise is typically that those public services then get run by these completely top-down autocratic bureaucracies that are not responsive to the public. And as a result, the initial result is great, but then because the democracy gets sort of, and the responsiveness of those public services isn't there, they end up losing public support. And so I think to reverse that, we have to start at the grassroots. We have to start at how do we make public services responsive to workers, responsive to the community, and harness all the knowledge that those people have. So I'd just like to propose that we think of visionaries not as people who give TED Talks and are billionaires, but as some of these people. And in my experience, it's true. I think there's a huge amount of knowledge, and just we saw at the beginning of this presentation, there's a huge amount of knowledge, even in this room, about how public services, could have a much more bold vision, and how we could, move more of the economy, more of our collective activity as a society under democratic control, and really benefit from it. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dru. That was very interesting. We have about 15 minutes for questions. I'm sure there are a lot of questions, so if you just want to put your hands up to show me that you want to ask a question, we'll have a mic runner come out to you down here, and then we'll go over to the end there.
I love your visions, Dru. I think one of the things that you're probably aware of that we all need to keep in mind is that the neoliberals are working ahead of us in some ways. That's what free trade agreements are about, making sure that, whatever we try to do will be stopped by somebody coming and saying, oh, but we were supposed to be making a profit out of that.
Thank you, and maybe we'll go over on the end, and then we'll let our panelists answer the two questions.
I feel totally re-inspired. These are two wonderful presentations, and they give me new ideas. I want to come back to Trevor's presentation. It was wonderful that you were looking at some European countries like us. You left out Holland. Now, I will forgive you for that. But for a minute, if you had just included maybe other countries like that strange country called Switzerland or Hungary, and some other countries that have been in the news related to the onslaught, I say onslaught, of all the refugees that came to Europe. That caused a real crisis in European democracy. And I was just saying, Germany, in the onslaught, that marvelous Angela Merkel stood up, and it looked like she was going to win with this million, proposal of accepting about 1 million refugees, and then suddenly the whole thing backfired, and so on and so forth. Could you comment on, you said you were looking at how much does the democracy really increase by having good public services. Could you comment on that and say, like, Germany has a very good public service, Holland has an excellent one, by the way, you forgot that. But anyhow, how did they stand up? And if you look at Southern Europe, Italy and some countries in the previous Balkan area, they had a horrible struggle to come to terms with the refugees and the survival of democracy. Did I make my point? No. Maybe.
All right, who would like to take a crack at answering those questions?
Do you want to take the first one? Or?
Yeah, I can take the first one. I mean, I totally agree that trade agreements are one of the main impediments to implementing any of these visions. I guess the only thought that I would add to that is that, I think trade agreements are horribly abstract, and that really plays against us in the sense that we have to, in order to get people excited about it, we have to posit all these hypothetical ideas of like, oh, what if we wanted to expand public services, or what if this company did this? But I think if we had a concrete vision of of our healthcare sector and how, not just how we want it to stay the same, but how we want it to be improved in a visionary way. Public transportation, same thing. If we wanted to talk about how the government, a cooperatively run, publicly owned telecommunications company would serve people better. If we want to do all these, if we can start articulating the case for all those things, then I think making the case against trade agreements becomes a lot easier, because people invest in those visions, and then the trade agreement is talking about taking them away.
I'll deal a little bit with the trade agreements first, and then try to answer the question over here, that very complex question that could take hours. In terms of trade agreements, I think that over the years I've written, talked about a lot about globalization, and people on the left have been fearful of, and have, I think, rightfully combated some of the inequalities created by globalization. But I think one of the things actually that we need to think of how globalization proceeded in a particular way. So I think actually attaching to that neoliberal globalization is a useful way of thinking about it. I think that we could imagine trade being beneficial to a lot of people if the rules were in place. And I think one of the things that even neoliberals have come to recognize through Brexit, through Trump, through a whole series of very nasty things going on in Europe, is that the neoliberal way of doing it has created a lot of fear, anxiety, and problems as a result. So, I think we need to proceed with trade agreements with some caution, but I think there is a way of thinking about creating a better world where trade actually benefits everybody and where the environment actually benefits from it. In terms of the question, and it really is a complex question about what's gone on in Europe in terms of refugee, and Harsha Wali was talking about, I think, quite properly yesterday about some of the issues around refugees, immigration, etc. Europe is a very complex situation. You have to remember that part of the reason many of the countries where the refugees first came across from Syria, Africa, etc., they've arrived in countries that are themselves fundamentally very poor and in difficult straits. For example, Greece, that is effectively bankrupted by European bankers, didn't have the money to actually handle it. But the way the rules are actually set up is the country where refugees first land, they get responsibilities. So countries like Greece didn't have the capacity or the help to actually deal with refugees. But the other thing about neoliberal globalization and the power dynamics that have driven politics for the last 30, 35 years and longer is that many of the refugees are the direct offshoot of policies of warmongering. So why is it there's so many refugees streaming out of the Middle East? It's because of a lot of stupid fucking wars that we got involved in over the last number of years and created that situation. So if we want a better world, we have to get hold of some of the policies that have led to real crises in those countries. So, but it's a very complex issue, and I will remember Holland next time.
Thank you. I think we've got one over there, and then one on the aisle right here, and then we'll come down one more.
I just wondered if since we've had the Liberal government, if they have reinstated door-to-door delivery, or has there been any changes in that with the Liberal government? And secondly, I've never really understood why Canada Post owns UPS. Like, isn't that defeating its purpose that it owns a private delivery service?
Would you like to take all three questions and answer, or would you like to answer one at a time?
Either way, your call.
Why don't you answer that one?
Okay, great. So what have the Liberals done around door-to-door? They stopped the cut. They stopped any more cuts from happening when they got in power, and even that required a fight. But that was a really successful victory for public services in the immediate term. I think certainly thousands of jobs were saved, and certainly door-to-door services were saved. In terms of what they're doing now, they've been sort of dragging their feet. They promised to sort of announce their new plan I think it was it was in the spring they were supposed to announce it, but they just haven't. And so now they're looking for new board members for Canada Post. So it's anybody's guess what's going to happen. But I would err on the side of caution in terms of expecting anything from the Liberals. I think everything's going to be a fight, and that's why the bargaining that's starting now and ending next summer is so exciting. In terms of Purolator, I mean, I think that, yeah, I mean, Canada Post owning Purolator, I don't see a problem with that necessarily, but certainly the way they leaned on it to sort of replace revenues during the strike, effectively sort of using Purolator as scabs for the missed out the missing postal service when the lockout was supposed to happen. That was less fortunate.
Right there.
Great, thank you. Hi, my name is Jeff. Thanks to both of you. Great presentations today. I got a lot of good ideas. Quick question for Trevor, both of you actually. One for Trevor quickly. I noticed in your presentation you used the word correlation specifically when talking about the data, and was I reading too much into it? I was hoping that there might have been some causality in there as well. Is there any actual evidence showing any sort of causal relationships between those data, or is it just correlation at this point? That's my question for Trevor. For Dru, I noticed that you seem to be focusing a lot of your efforts on public and government, trying to get them on board with what you're trying to do. I'm wondering if you did had any activities towards dealing with your opponents, your neoliberal opponents, especially in the private sector, that might be pushing for this privatization. Did you actually have any activities around trying to fight them off at the same time as trying to get the government and the public on your side?
Do you want to take another question?
Sure, we can take the last one. Just two down there.
Just a very simple question, first of all for Trevor, and then an observation. I was curious as to whether the percentage figures for public service included people in the military. I assume it did not. I'll just observe there's an interesting double standard there in a lot of countries around employing public servants as opposed to employing persons in the armed forces and expenditures in the two areas. I think if we were to launch the notion of public charging stations at post offices, you'd get a lot of pushback. That's an absurd idea. But spending billions of dollars on jet fighters, which will contribute virtually nothing to my standard of living, somehow isn't.
I'll answer Jeff's question first. Those are just correlational, so you couldn't necessarily read anything in it. In order to actually get a better sense of cause and effect, I'd actually have to do some kind of time series. What you can see over time is through a lot of the countries, including in Europe, you've seen a decline in voting. Okay, so, but if you were to also then, but it's been much stronger, and again, in the Anglo democracies. I think you'd actually have to go to some much more fine-tuned kind of analyses, probably surveys with people to actually prove the case. So at this point, it's only correlational, but it's certainly suggestive of what's actually going on there. The question about the military, I think the military figures are outside of these statistics, but there is an interesting thing in terms of that I've talked about actually, probably in past sessions here at with Parkland, is the United States figures for unemployment over the years, which a lot of people point to, have been artificially kept low over the years because of the size of the military, which you don't have in the case of so many of the other countries. The other thing that also over the years has kept the unemployment figures in the United States artificially low is the large number of people, of course, in prison. who would be normally part of the workforce by age, education, everything else. And that gets to something that was raised yesterday by again Harsha Walia, talking about the increasing of the money and the forces of coercion by the state as the amount of money spent on legitimation functions such as healthcare, education, things like that has gone down. You see more money going into the coercive functions of the state, such as police, military, etc. Yeah.
All right, well, we are out of time. Before we end, I just want to remind you all to please fill out your feedback forms. And once again, let's just thank our two speakers.
Thank you. Thank you.